Chapter 21 of Hans Brinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Hans Brinker, or the Silver Skates, by Mary Mapes Dodge. Chapter 21, Minear, Cleef, and his Bill of Fare. The boys soon found an unpretending establishment near the Breedstraat, with a funnily painted lion over the door. This was the Rode Leeuw, or Red Lion, kept by one Huygens Cleef, a stout Dutchman with short legs and a very long pipe. By this time they were in a ravenous condition. The tiffin, taken at Haarlem, had served only to give them an appetite, and this had been heightened by their exercise and swift sail upon the canal. "Come, mine host, give us what you can," cried Peter rather pompously. "I can give you anything, everything," answered Mynheer Cleef, performing a difficult bow. "Well, give us sausage and pudding." "Ah, mynheer, the sausage is all gone, and there is no pudding." "Salmagundi, then, and plenty of it." "That is out also, young master." "Eggs, and be quick." "Winter eggs are very poor eating," answered the innkeeper, puckering his lips and lifting his eyebrows. "No eggs? Well, caviar." The Dutchman raised his fat hands. "Caviar? That is made of gold. Who has caviar to sell?" Peter had sometimes eaten it at home. He knew that it was made of the roes of the sturgeon and certain other large fish, but he had no idea of its cost. "Well, mine host, what have you?" "What have I? Everything. I have rye bread, sauerkraut, potato salad, and the fattest herring in Laden." "What do you say, boys?" asked the captain. "Will that do?" "Yes!" cried the famished youths. "If you'll only be quick." Mynheer moved off like one walking in his sleep, but soon opened his eyes wide at the miraculous manner in which his herring were made to disappear. Next came, or rather went, potato salad, rye bread, and coffee, then Utrecht water flavored with orange, and finally slices of dried gingerbread. This last delicacy was not on the regular bill of fare, but Mynheer Cleef, driven to extremes, solemnly produced it from his own private stores, and gave only a placid blink when his voracious young travelers started up, declaring they had eaten enough. "I should think so," he exclaimed internally, but his smooth face gave no sign. Softly rubbing his hands, he asked, "Will your worships have beds?" "Will your worships have beds?" mocked Carl. "What do you mean? Do we look sleepy?" "Not at all, master, but I would cause them to be warmed and aired. None sleep under damp sheets at the Red Lion." "Ah, I understand. Shall we come back here to sleep, captain?" Peter was accustomed to finer lodgings, but this was a frolic. "Why not?" he replied. "We can fare excellently here." "Your worship speaks only the truth," said Mynheer with great deference. "How fine to be called your worship!" laughed Ludwig aside to Lambert, while Peter replied, "Well, mine host, you may get the rooms ready by 9. "I have one beautiful chamber with 3 beds that will hold all of your worships," said Mynheer Cleef coaxingly. "That will do." "Whew!" whistled Carl when they reached the street. Ludwig startled. "What now?" "Nothing. Only Mynheer Cleef of the Red Lion little thinks how we shall make things spin in that same room tonight. We'll set the bolsters flying." "Order!" cried the captain. "Now, boys, I must seek this great Dr. Boekman before I sleep. If he is in Leyden, it will be no great task to find him, for he always puts up at the Golden Eagle when he comes here. I wonder that you did not all go to bed at once. Still, as you are awake, what say you to walking with Ben up by the museum or the Stadhuis?" "Agreed," said Ludwig and Lambert, but Jacob preferred to go with Peter. In vain Ben tried to persuade him to remain at the inn and rest. He declared that he had never felt better, and wished of all things to take a look at the city, for it was his first stop mit Laden. "Oh, it will not harm him," said Lambert. "How long the day has been, and what glorious sport we have had! It hardly seems possible that we left Brook only this morning." Jacob yawned. "I have enjoyed it well," he said, "but it seems to me at least a week since we started." Carl laughed and muttered something about 20 naps. "Here we are at the corner. Remember, we all meet at the Red Lion at 8, said the captain, as he and Jacob walked away. End of chapter. Chapter 22 of Hans Brinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Hans Brinker, or The Silver Skates, by Mary Mapes Dodge. Chapter 22. The Red Lion Becomes Dangerous. The boys were glad to find a blazing fire awaiting them upon their return to the Red Lion. Carl and his party were there first. Soon afterward Peter and Jacob came in. They had inquired in vain concerning Dr. Boekman. All they could ascertain was that he had been seen in Haarlem that morning. "As for his being in Laden," the landlord of the Golden Eagle had said to Peter, "the thing is impossible. He always lodges here when in town. By this time there would be a crowd at my door waiting to consult him. Bah, people make such fools of themselves." "He is called a great surgeon," said Peter. "Yes, the greatest in Holland. But what of that? What of being the greatest pill-choker and knife-slasher in the world? The man is a bear. Only last month on this very spot he called me a pig before 3 customers." "No!" exclaimed Peter, trying to look surprised and indignant. "Yes, master, a pig," repeated the landlord, puffing at his pipe with an injured air. "Bah! If he did not pay fine prices and bring customers to my house, I would sooner see him in the Vleit Canal than give him lodging." Perhaps mine host felt that he was speaking too openly to a stranger, or it may be that he saw a smile lurking in Peter's face, for he added sharply, "Come now, what more do you wish? Supper? Beds?" "No, mynheer. I am but searching for Dr. Boekman." "Go find him. He is not in Laden." Peter was not to be put off so easily. He succeeded in obtaining permission to leave a note for the famous surgeon, or rather, he bought from his amiable landlord the privilege of writing it there, and a promise that it should be promptly delivered when Dr. Boekman arrived. This accomplished, Peter and Jacob returned to the Red Lion. This inn had once been a fine house, the home of a rich burgher, but having grown old and shabby, it had passed through many hands until finally it had fallen into the possession of Mynheer Cleef. He was fond of saying as he looked up at its dingy, broken walls, "Mend it and paint it, and there's not a prettier house in Laden." It stood 6 stories high from the street. The first 3 were of equal breadth, but of various heights. The last 3 were in the great, high roof, and grew smaller and smaller like a set of double steps until the top one was lost in a point. The roof was built of short, shining tiles, and the windows, with their little panes, seemed to be scattered irregularly over the face of the building, without the slightest attention to outward effect. But the public room on the ground floor was the landlord's joy and pride. He never said, "Mend it and paint it," there, for everything was in the highest condition of Dutch neatness and order. If you will but open your mind's eye, you may look into the apartment. Imagine a large, bare room, with a floor that seemed to be made of squares cut out of glazed earthen pie dishes. First a yellow piece, then a red, until the whole looked like a vast checkerboard. Fancy a dozen high-backed wooden chairs standing around. Then, a great hollow chimney place all aglow with its blazing fire, reflected 100 times in the polished steel fire-dogs. A tiled hearth, tiled sides, tiled top, with a Dutch sentence upon it, and over all, high above one's head, a narrow mantel-shelf filled with shining brass candlesticks, pipe-lighters, and tinder-boxes. Then see, in one end of the room, 3 pine tables, in the other, a closet and a deal dresser. The latter is filled with mugs, dishes, pipes, tankards, earthen and glass bottles, and is guarded at one end by a brass-hooped keg standing upon long legs. Everything is dim with tobacco smoke, but otherwise as clean as soap and sand can make it. Next, picture 2 sleepy, shabby-looking men, in wooden shoes, seated near the glowing fireplace, hugging their knees and smoking short, stumpy pipes. Minear Cleef walking softly and heavily about, clad in leather knee-breeches, felt shoes, and a green jacket wider than it is long. Then throw a heap of skates in the corner, and put 6 tired, well-dressed boys, in various attitudes, upon the wooden chairs, and you will see the coffee-room of the Red Lion just as it appeared at 9 o'clock upon the evening of December 6. For supper, gingerbread again, slices of Dutch sausage, rye bread sprinkled with anise seed, pickles, a bottle of Utrecht water, and a pot of very mysterious coffee. The boys were ravenous enough to take all they could get and pronounce it excellent. Ben made wry faces, but Jacob declared he had never eaten a better meal. After they had laughed and talked a while, and counted their money by way of settling a discussion that arose concerning their expenses, the captain marched his company off to bed, led on by a greasy pioneer boy who carried skates and a candlestick instead of an axe. One of the ill-favored men by the fire had shuffled toward the dresser and was ordering a mug of beer, just as Ludwig, who brought up the rear, was stepping from the apartment. "I don't like that fellow's eye," he whispered to Carl. "He looks like a pirate or something of that kind." "Looks like a granny," answered Carl in sleepy disdain. Ludwig laughed uneasily. "Granny or no granny," he whispered, "I tell you he looks just like one of those men in the Voetspoelen." "Pooh!" sneered Carl. "I knew it. That picture was too much for you. Look sharp now and see if yon fellow with the candle doesn't look like the other villain." "No, indeed, his face is as honest as a Gouda cheese. But I say, Carl, that really was a horrid picture." "Huh! What did you stare at it so long for?" "I couldn't help it." By this time the boys had reached the beautiful room with 3 beds in it. A dumpy little maiden with long earrings met them at the doorway, dropped them a curtsy, and passed out. She carried a long-handled thing that resembled a frying-pan with a cover. "I am glad to see that," said Van Monen to Ben. "What?" "Why, the warming-pan. It's full of hot ashes. She's been heating our beds." "Oh, a warming-pan, eh? Much obliged to her, I'm sure," said Ben, too sleepy to make any further comment. Meantime, Ludwig still talked of the picture that had made such a strong impression upon him. He had seen it in a shop window during their walk. It was a poorly painted thing, representing 2 men tied back to back, standing on shipboard, surrounded by a group of seamen who were preparing to cast them together into the sea. This mode of putting prisoners to death was called voetspoelen, or feet-washing, and was practiced by the Dutch upon the pirates of Dunkirk in 1605, and again by the Spaniards against the Dutch, in the horrible massacre that followed the siege of Haarlem. Bad as the painting was, the expression upon the pirates' faces was well given. Sullen and despairing as they seemed, they wore such a cruel, malignant aspect that Ludwig had felt a secret satisfaction in contemplating their helpless condition. He might have forgotten the scene by this time but for that ill-looking man by the fire. Now, while he capered about boylike and threw himself with an antic into his bed, He inwardly hoped that the voetspoelen would not haunt his dreams. It was a cold, cheerless room. A fire had been newly kindled in the burnished stove, and seemed to shiver even while it was trying to burn. The windows, with their funny little panes, were bare and shiny, and the cold waxed floor looked like a sheet of yellow ice. 3 rush-bottomed chairs stood stiffly against the wall, alternating with 3 narrow wooden bedsteads that made the room look like the deserted ward of a hospital. At any other time the boys would have found it quite impossible to sleep in pairs, especially in such narrow quarters, but tonight they lost all fear of being crowded, and longed only to lay their weary bodies upon the feather beds that lay lightly upon each cot. Had the boys been in Germany instead of Holland, they might have been covered, also, by a bed of down or feathers. This peculiar form of luxury was at that time adopted only by wealthy or eccentric Hollanders. Ludwig, as we have seen, had not quite lost his friskiness, but the other boys, after 1 or 2 feeble attempts at pillow fighting, composed themselves for the night with the greatest dignity. Nothing like fatigue for making boys behave themselves. "Good night, boys," said Peter's voice from under the covers. "Good night," called back everybody but Jacob, who already lay snoring beside the captain. "I say," shouted Carl after a moment, "don't sneeze, anybody. Ludwig's in a fright." "No such thing," retorted Ludwig in a smothered voice. Then there was a little whispered dispute, which was ended by Carl saying, "For my part, I don't know what fear is, but you really are a timid fellow, Ludwig." Ludwig grunted sleepily, but made no further reply. It was the middle of the night. The fire had shivered itself to death, and in place of its gleams, little squares of moonlight lay upon the floor, slowly, slowly shifting their way across the room. Something else was moving also, but the boys did not see it. Sleeping boys keep but a poor lookout. During the early hours of the night, Jacob Poot had been gradually but surely winding himself with all the bed covers. He now lay like a monster chrysalis beside the half-frozen Peter, who, accordingly, was skating with all his might over the coldest, bleakest of dreamland icebergs. Something else, I say, besides the moonlight, was moving across the bare, polished floor, moving not quite so slowly, but quite as stealthily. "Wake up, Ludwig, the voetspoelen is growing real." No, Ludwig does not waken, but he moans in his sleep. Does not Carl hear it? Carl the brave, the fearless? No, Carl is dreaming of the race. And Jacob? Van Monen? Ben? Not they. They too are dreaming of the race, and Katrinka is singing through their dreams, laughing, flitting past them. Now and then a wave from the great organ surges through their midst. Still the thing moves, slowly, slowly. "Peter, Captain Peter, there is danger!" Peter heard no call, but in his dream he slid a few thousand feet from one iceberg to another, and the shock awoke him. Whew! How cold he was! He gave a hopeless, desperate tug at the chrysalis in vain. Sheet, blanket, and spread were firmly around Jacob's inanimate form. Clear moonlight, he thought. We shall have pleasant weather tomorrow. Halloo! What's that? He saw the moving thing, or rather, something black crouching upon the floor, for it had halted as Peter stirred. He watched in silence. Soon it moved again, nearer and nearer. It was a man crawling upon hands and feet. The captain's first impulse was to call out, but he took an instant to consider matters. The creeper had a shining knife in one hand. This was ugly, but Peter was naturally self-possessed. When the head turned, Peter's eyes were closed, as if in sleep, but at other times Nothing could be keener, sharper than the captain's gaze. Closer, closer crept the robber. His back was very near Peter now. The knife was laid softly upon the floor. One careful arm reached forth stealthily to drag the clothes from the chair by the captain's bed. The robbery was commenced. Now was Peter's time. Holding his breath, he sprang up and leaped with all his strength upon the robber's back, stunning the rascal with the force of the blow. To seize the knife was but a second's work. The robber began to struggle, but Peter sat like a giant astride the prostrate form. "If you stir," said the brave boy in as terrible a voice as he could command, "stir but 1 inch, I will plunge this knife into your neck. Boys, boys, wake up!" he shouted, still pressing down the black head, and holding the knife at pricking distance. "Give us a hand! I've got him!" The chrysalis rolled over, but made no other sign. "Up, boys!" cried Peter, never budging. "Ludwig, Lambert, Dunder, are you all dead?" Dead? Not they. Van Monen and Ben were on their feet in an instant. "Hey! What now?" they shouted. "I've got a robber here," said Peter coolly. "Lie still, you scoundrel, or I'll slice your head off. Now, boys, cut out your bedcord. Plenty of time. He's a dead man if he stirs." Peter felt that he weighed 1,000 pounds. So he did, with that knife in his hand. The man growled and swore, but dared not move. Ludwig was up by this time. He had a great jackknife, the pride of his heart, in his breeches pocket. It could do good service now. They bared the bedstead in a moment. It was laced backward and forward with a rope. "I'll cut it," cried Ludwig, sawing away at the knot. "Hold him tight, Peter." "Never fear," answered the captain, giving the robber a warning prick. The boys were soon pulling at the rope like good fellows. It was out at last, a long, stout piece. "Now, boys," commanded the captain, "lift up his rascally arms. Cross his hands over his back. That's right. Excuse me for being in the way. Tie them tight. Yes, and his feet too, the villain!" cried the boys in great excitement, tying knot after knot with Herculean jerks. The prisoner changed his tone. "Oh, oh," he moaned. "Spare a poor sick man. I was but walking in my sleep." "Ugh!" grunted Lambert, still tugging away at the rope. "Asleep, were you? Well, we'll wake you up." The man muttered fierce oaths between his teeth, then cried in a piteous voice, "Unbind me, good young masters. I have 5 little children at home. By Saint Bavon, I swear to give you each a 10-guilder piece if you will but free me." "Ha ha!" laughed Peter. "Ha ha!" laughed the other boys. Then came threats that made Ludwig fairly shudder, though he continued to bind and tie with redoubled energy. "Hold up, Minear housebreaker," said Van Monen in a warning voice. "That knife is very near your throat. If you make the captain nervous, there is no telling what may happen." The robber took the hint and fell into a sullen silence. Just at this moment the chrysalis upon the bed stirred and sat erect. "What's the matter?" he asked, without opening his eyes. "Matter?" echoed Ludwig, half trembling, half laughing. "Get up, Jacob. Here's work for you. Come sit on this fellow's back while we get into our clothes. We're half perished." "What fellow? Donder!" "Hurrah for Poot!" cried all the boys as Jacob, sliding quickly to the floor, bedclothes and all, took in the state of affairs at a glance and sat heavily beside Peter on the robber's back. Oh, didn't the fellow groan then! "No use in holding him down any longer, boys," said Peter, rising, but bending as he did so to draw a pistol from the man's belt. "You see, I've been keeping a guard over this pretty little weapon for the last 10 minutes. It's cocked, and the least wriggle might have set it off. No danger now. I must dress myself. You and I, Lambert, will go for the police. I'd no idea it was so cold." "Where's Carl?" asked one of the boys. They looked at one another. Carl certainly was not among them. "Oh!" cried Ludwig, frightened at last. "Where is he? Perhaps he's had a fight with the robber and got killed." "Not a bit of it," said Peter quietly as he buttoned his stout jacket. "Look under the beds." They did so. Carl was not there. Just then they heard a commotion on the stairway. Ben hastened to open the door. The landlord almost tumbled in. He was armed with a big blunderbuss. 2 or 3 lodgers followed, then the daughter, with an upraised frying pan in one hand and a candle in the other, and behind her, looking pale and frightened, the gallant Carl. "There's your man, mine host," said Peter, nodding toward the prisoner. Mine host raised his blunderbuss, the girl screamed, and Jacob, more nimble than usual, rolled quickly from the robber's back. "Don't fire!" cried Peter. "He is tied hand and foot. Let's roll him over and see what he looks like." Carl stepped briskly forward with a bluster. "Yes, we'll turn him over in a way he won't like. Lucky we've caught him." "Ha, ha!" laughed Ludwig. "Where were you, Master Carl?" "Where was I?" retorted Carl angrily. "Why, I went to give the alarm, to be sure." All the boys exchanged glances, but they were too happy and elated to say anything ill-natured. Carl certainly was bold enough now. He took the lead while 3 others aided him in turning the helpless man. While the robber lay face up, scowling and muttering, Ludwig took the candlestick from the girl's hand. "I must have a good look at the beauty," he said, drawing closer, but the words were no sooner spoken than he turned pale and started so violently that he almost dropped the candle. "The voetspoelen!" he cried. "Why, boys, it's the man who sat by the fire." "Of course it is," answered Peter. "We counted out money before him like simpletons. But what have we to do with voetspoelen, brother Ludwig? A month in jail is punishment enough." The landlord's daughter had left the room. She now ran in, holding up a pair of huge wooden shoes. "See, father," she cried. "Here are his great ugly boats. It's the man that we put in the next room after the young masters went to bed. Ah, it was wrong to send the poor young gentleman up here so far out of sight and sound." "The scoundrel!" hissed the landlord. "He has disgraced my house. I go for the police at once." In less than 15 minutes 2 drowsy-looking officers were in the room. After telling Mynheer Cleef that he must appear early in the morning with the boys and make his complaint before a magistrate, they marched off with their prisoner. One would think the captain and his band could have slept no more that night, but the mooring has not yet been found that can prevent youth and an easy conscience from drifting down the river of dreams. The boys were much too fatigued to let so slight a thing as capturing a robber bind them to wakefulness. They were soon in bed again, floating away to strange scenes made of familiar things. Ludwig and Carl had spread their bedding upon the floor. One had already forgotten the voetspoelen, the race, everything. But Carl was wide awake. He heard the carillons ringing out their solemn nightly music, and the watchman's noisy clapper putting in discord at the quarter hours. He saw the moonshine glide away from the window and the red morning light come pouring in, and all the while he kept thinking, "Pooh, what a goose I've made of myself." Carl Schummel, alone, with none to look or to listen, was not quite so grand a fellow as Carl Schummel strutting about in his boots. End of chapter. Chapter 23 of Hans Brinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Hans Brinker, or The Silver Skates, by Mary Mapes Dodge. Chapter 23, Before the Court. You may believe that the landlord's daughter bestirred herself to prepare a good meal for the boys next morning. Minear had a Chinese gong that could make more noise than a dozen breakfast bells. Its hideous reveille, clanging through the house, generally startled the drowsiest lodgers into activity, but the maiden would not allow it to be sounded this morning. "Let the brave young gentlemen sleep," she said to the greasy kitchen boy. "They shall be warmly fed when they awaken." It was 10 o'clock when Captain Peter and his band came straggling down one by one. "A pretty hour," said mine host gruffly. "It is high time we were before the court. Fine business, this, for a respectable inn. You will testify truly, young masters, that you found most excellent fare and lodging at the Red Lion?" "Of course we will," answered Carl saucily. "And pleasant company, too, though they visit at rather unseasonable hours." A stare and a "humph" was all the answer Minear made to this, but the daughter was more communicative. Shaking her earrings at Carl, she said sharply, "Not so very pleasant either, master traveler, if you could judge by the way you ran away from it." "Impertinent creature!" hissed Carl under his breath as he began busily to examine his skate straps. Meantime the kitchen boy, listening outside at the crack of the door, doubled himself with silent laughter. After breakfast the boys went to the police court, accompanied by Huygens Cleef and his daughter. Minear's testimony was principally to the effect that such a thing as a robber at the Red Lion had been unheard of until last night, and as for the Red Lion, it was a most respectable inn, as respectable as any house in Laden. Each boy, in turn, told all that he knew of the affair, and identified the prisoner in the box as the same man who entered their room in the dead of night. Ludwig was surprised to find that the prisoner in the box was a man of ordinary size, especially after he had described him, under oath, to the court as a tremendous fellow with great square shoulders and legs of prodigious weight. Jacob swore that he was awakened by the robber kicking and thrashing upon the floor, and immediately afterward, Peter and the rest, feeling sorry that they had not explained the matter to their sleepy comrade, testified that the man had not moved a muscle from the moment the point of the dagger touched his throat, until, bound from head to foot, he was rolled over for inspection. The landlord's daughter made one boy blush and all the court smile by declaring, "If it hadn't been for that handsome young gentleman there," pointing to Peter, "they might have all been murdered in their beds, for the dreadful man had a great shining knife most as long as your honor's arm, and she believed the handsome young gentleman had struggled hard enough to get it away from him, but he was too modest, bless him, to say so." Finally, after a little questioning and cross-questioning from the public prosecutor, the witnesses were dismissed, and the robber was handed over to the consideration of the criminal court. "The scoundrel!" said Carl savagely when the boys reached the street. "He ought to be sent to jail at once. If I had been in your place, Peter, I certainly should have killed him outright." "He was fortunate then in falling into gentler hands," was Peter's quiet reply. "It appears he has been arrested before under a charge of housebreaking. He did not succeed in robbing this time, but he broke the door fastenings, and that I believe constitutes a burglary in the eyes of the law. He was armed with a knife, too, and that makes it worse for him, poor fellow." "Poor fellow," mimicked Carl. "One would think he was your brother." "So he is my brother, and yours too, Carl Schummel, for that matter," answered Peter, looking into Carl's eye. "We cannot say what we might have become under other circumstances. We have been bolstered up from evil, since the hour we were born. A happy home and good parents might have made that man a fine fellow instead of what he is. God grant that the law may cure and not crush him." "Amen to that," said Lambert heartily, while Ludwig van Holp looked at his brother in such a bright, proud way that Jacob Poot, who was an only son, wished from his heart that the little form buried in the old church at home had lived to grow up beside him. "Huh," said Carl. It's all very well to be saintly and forgiving and all that sort of thing, but I'm naturally hard. All these fine ideas seem to rattle off me like hailstones, and it's nobody's business either if they do." Peter recognized a touch of good feeling in this clumsy concession. Holding out his hand, he said in a frank, hearty tone, "Come, lad, shake hands, and let us be good friends, even if we don't exactly agree on all questions." "We do agree better than you think," sulked Carl as he returned Peter's grasp. "All right," responded Peter briskly. "Now, Van Monen, we await Benjamin's wishes. Where would he like to go?" "To the Egyptian Museum," answered Lambert after holding a brief consultation with Ben. "That is on the Breedstraat. To the museum let it be. Come, boys." End of chapter. Chapter 24 of Hans Brinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Hans Brinker, or The Silver Skates, by Mary Mapes Dodge. Chapter 24. The Beleaguered Cities. "This open square before us," said Lambert as he and Ben walked on together, "is pretty in summer, with its shady trees. They call it the Ruin. Years ago it was covered with houses, and the Roppenburg Canal here ran through the street. Well, one day a barge loaded with 40,000 pounds of gunpowder, bound for Delft, was lying alongside, and the bargemen took a notion to cook their dinner on the deck, and before anyone knew it, sir, the whole thing blew up, killing lots of persons and scattering about 300 houses to the winds." "What!" exclaimed Ben. "Did the explosion destroy 300 houses?" "Yes, sir. My father was in Laden at the time. He says it was terrible. The explosion occurred just at noon, and it was like a volcano. All this part of the town was on fire in an instant, buildings tumbling down, and men, women, and children groaning under the ruins. The king himself came to the city and acted nobly, father says, staying out in the streets all night, encouraging the survivors in their efforts to arrest the fire and rescue as many as possible from under the heaps of stone and rubbish. Through his means a collection for the benefit of the sufferers was raised throughout the kingdom, besides 100,000 guilders paid out of the treasury. Father was only 19 years old then. It was in 1807, I believe, but he remembers it perfectly. A friend of his, Professor Luzac, was among the killed. They have a tablet erected to his memory in St. Peter's Church, farther on. The queerest thing you ever saw, with an image of the professor carved upon it, representing him just as he looked when he was found after the explosion." "What a strange idea! Isn't Boerhaave's monument in St. Peter's also?" "I cannot remember. Perhaps Peter knows." The captain delighted Ben by saying that the monument was there, and that he thought they might be able to see it during the day. "Lambert," continued Peter, "ask Ben if he saw Van der Werf's portrait at the town hall last night." "No," said Lambert, "I can answer for him. It was too late to go in. I say, boys, it is really wonderful how much Ben knows. Why, he has told me a volume of Dutch history already. I'll wager he has the siege of Leyden at his tongue's end." "His tongue must burn, then," interposed Ludwig, "for if Bilderdyk's account is true, it was a pretty hot affair." Ben was looking at them with an inquiring smile. "We are speaking of the siege of Leyden," explained Lambert. "Oh, yes," said Ben eagerly. "I had forgotten all about it. This was the very place. Let's give old Van der Werf 3 cheers. Her—" Van Monen uttered a hasty "Hush!" and explained that, patriotic as the Dutch were, the police would soon have something to say if a party of boys cheered in the streets at midday. "What? Not cheer Van der Werf?" cried Ben indignantly. "One of the greatest chaps in history? Only think! Didn't he hold out against those murderous Spaniards for months and months? There was the town, surrounded on all sides by the enemy, great black forts sending fire and death into the very heart of the city, but no surrender. Every man a hero, women and children too, brave and fierce as lions, provisions giving out, the very grass from between the paving stones gone, till people were glad to eat horses and cats and dogs and rats. Then came the plague, hundreds dying in the streets, but no surrender. Then when they could bear no more, when the people, brave as they were, crowded about Van der Werf in the public square begging him to give up, what did the noble old burgomaster say? 'I have sworn to defend this city, and with God's help I mean to do it. If my body can satisfy your hunger, take it, and divide it among you, but expect no surrender so long as I am alive.' Hurrah! Ben was getting uproarious. Lambert playfully clapped his hand over his friend's mouth. The result was one of those quick india-rubber scuffles, fearful to behold, but delightful to human nature in its pollywog state. "What was the matter, Pen?" asked Jacob, hurrying forward. "Oh, nothing at all," panted Ben, "except that Van Monen was afraid of starting an English riot in this orderly town. He stopped my cheering for old Van der... Ja, it is no good to cheer, to make the noise for that. You will see old Van der Does likeness mit the Stadthuis." "See old Van der Does? I thought it was Van der Werf's picture they had there." "Ja," responded Jacob. "Van der Werf. Well, what of it? Both is just as good." "Yes, Van der Does was a noble old Dutchman, but he was not Van der Werf. I know he defended the city like a brick, and..." "Now what for you say dat, Penchamin? He no defend the city mit brick. He fight like good soldier mit his guns. You like make the fun mit everything's touch." No. I said he defended the city like a brick. That is very high praise, I would have you understand. We English call even the Duke of Wellington a brick. Jacob looked puzzled, but his indignation was already on the ebb. "Well, it is no matter. I no think before soldier mean brick, but it is no matter." Ben laughed good-naturedly, and seeing that his cousin was tired of talking in English, he turned to his friend of the two languages. "Van Monen, they say the very carrier pigeons that brought news of relief to the besieged city are somewhere here in Laden. I really should like to see them. Just think of it! At the very height of the trouble, if the wind didn't turn and blow in the waters, and drown hundreds of Spaniards and enable the Dutch boats to sail in right over the land with men and provisions to the very gates of the city. The pigeons, you know, did great service in bearing letters to and fro. I have read somewhere that they were reverently cared for from that day, and when they died, they were stuffed and placed for safe keeping in the town hall. We must be sure to have a look at them." Van Monen laughed. "On that principle, Ben, I suppose when you go to Rome you'll expect to see the identical goose who saved the Capitol. But it will be easy enough to see the pigeons. They are in the same building with Van der Werf's portrait. Which was the greater defense, Ben, the siege of Leyden or the siege of Haarlem?" "Well," replied Ben thoughtfully, "Van der Werf is one of my heroes. We all have our historical pets, you know, but I really think the siege of Haarlem brought out a braver, more heroic resistance even than the Leyden one. Besides, they set the Leyden sufferers an example of courage and fortitude, for their turn came first." "I don't know much about the Haarlem siege," said Lambert, "except that it was in 1573. Who beat?" "The Spaniards," said Ben. "The Dutch had stood out for months. Not a man would yield, nor a woman either, for that matter. They shouldered arms and fought gallantly beside their husbands and fathers. 300 of them did duty under Canoa Hesselar, a great woman, and brave as Joan of Arc. All this time the city was surrounded by the Spaniards under Frederick of Toledo, son of that beauty, the Duke of Alva. Cut off from all possible help from without, there seemed to be no hope for the inhabitants, but they shouted defiance over the city walls. They even threw bread into the enemy's camps to show that they were not afraid of starvation. Up to the last they held out bravely, waiting for the help that never could come, growing bolder and bolder until their provisions were exhausted. Then it was terrible. In time, hundreds of famished creatures fell dead in the streets, and the living had scarcely strength to bury them. At last they made the desperate resolution that, rather than perish by lingering torture, the strongest would form a square, placing the weakest in the center, and rush in a body to their death, with a faint chance of being able to fight their way through the enemy. The Spaniards received a hint of this, and believing that there was nothing the Dutch would not dare to do, they concluded to offer terms. High time, I should think. Yes, with falsehood and treachery they soon obtained an entrance into the city, promising protection and forgiveness to all, except those whom the citizens themselves would acknowledge as deserving of death. "You don't say so," said Lambert, quite interested. "That ended the business, I suppose." "Not a bit of it," returned Ben, for the Duke of Alva had already given his son orders to show mercy to none. "Ah, that was where the great Haarlem massacre came in. I remember now. You can't wonder that the Hollanders dislike Spain when you read of the way they were butchered by Alva and his hosts, though I admit that our side sometimes retaliated terribly. But as I have told you before, I have a very indistinct idea of historical matters. Everything is confusion, from the Flood to the Battle of Waterloo. One thing is plain, however, the Duke of Alva was about the worst specimen of a man that ever lived." "That gives only a faint idea of him," said Ben, "but I hate to think of such a wretch. What if he had brains, and military skill, and all that sort of thing? Give me such men as Van der Werf and... What now?" "Why," said Van Mounen, who was looking up and down the street in a bewildered way, "we've walked right past the museum, and I don't see the boys. Let us go back." End of chapter. Chapter 25 of Hans Brinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Hans Brinker, or the Silver Skates, by Mary Mapes Dodge. Chapter 25. Laden. The boys met at the museum and were soon engaged in examining its extensive collection of curiosities, receiving a new insight into Egyptian life, ancient and modern. Ben and Lambert had often visited the British Museum, but that did not prevent them from being surprised at the richness of the Laden collection. There were household utensils, wearing apparel, weapons, musical instruments, sarcophagi, and mummies of men, women, and cats, ibexes, and other creatures. They saw a massive gold armlet that had been worn by an Egyptian king at a time when some of these same mummies, perhaps, were nimbly treading the streets of Thebes, and jewels and trinkets such as Pharaoh's daughter wore, and the children of Israel borrowed when they departed out of Egypt. There were other interesting relics from Rome and Greece, and some curious Roman pottery which had been discovered in digging near the Hague, relics of the days when the countrymen of Julius Caesar had settled there. Where have they not settled? I, for one, would hardly be astonished if relics of the ancient Romans should some day be found deep under the grass growing around the Bunker Hill monument. When the boys left this museum, they went to another and saw a wonderful collection of fossil animals, skeletons, birds, minerals, precious stones, and other natural specimens, but as they were not learned men, they could only walk about and stare, enjoy the little knowledge of natural history they possessed, and wish with all their hearts they had acquired more. Even the skeleton of the mouse puzzled Jacob. What wonder? He was not used to seeing the cat-fearing little creatures running about in their bones, and how could he ever have imagined their necks to be so queer? Besides the Museum of Natural History, there was St. Peter's Church to be visited, containing Professor Luzak's memorial, and Boerhaave's monument of white and black marble, with its urn and carved symbols of the 4 ages of life, and its medallion of Boerhaave, adorned with his favorite motto, Simplex sigillum veri. They also obtained admittance to a tea garden, which in summer was a favorite resort of the citizens, and, passing naked oaks and fruit trees, ascended to a high mound which stood in the center. This was the site of a round tower now in ruins, said by some to have been built by Hengist, the Anglo-Saxon king, and by others to have been the castle of one of the ancient counts of Holland. As the boys walked about on the top of its stone wall, they could get but a poor view of the surrounding city. The tower stood higher when, more than 2 centuries ago, the inhabitants of Beleaguered Laden shouted to the watcher on its top their wild, despairing cries, "Is there any help? Are the waters rising? What do you see?" And for months he could only answer, "No help. I see around us nothing but the enemy." Ben pushed these thoughts away and, resolutely looking down into the bare tea garden, filled it in imagination with gay summer groups. He tried to forget old battle clouds, and picture only curling wreaths of tobacco smoke rising from among men, women, and children enjoying their tea and coffee in the open air. But a tragedy came in spite of him. Poot was bending over the edge of the high wall. It would be just like him to grow dizzy and tumble off. Ben turned impatiently away. If the fellow with his weak head knew no better than to be venturesome, why, let him tumble. Horror! What mean that heavy crashing sound? Ben could not stir. He could only gasp, "Jacob!" "Jacob!" cried another startled voice, and another. Ready to faint, Ben managed to turn his head. He saw a crowd of boys on the edge of the wall opposite, but Jacob was not there. "Good heavens!" he cried, springing forward. "Where is my cousin?" The crowd parted. It was only 4 boys after all. There sat Jacob in their midst, holding his sides and laughing heartily. "Did I frighten you all?" he said in his native Dutch. "Well, I will tell you how it was. There was a big stone lying on the wall, and I put my foot out just to push it a little, you see, and the first thing I knew, down went the stone all the way to the bottom and left me sitting here on top with both my feet in the air. If I had not thrown myself back at that moment, I certainly should have rolled over after the stone. Well, it is no matter. Help me up, boys." "You're hurt," said Ben, seeing a shade of seriousness pass over his cousin's face as they lifted him to his feet. Jacob tried to laugh again. "Oh, no, I feels a little hurt when I stand up, but it is no matter." The monument to Van der Werf in the Hooglandische Kerk was not accessible that day, but the boys spent a few pleasant moments in the Stadhuis or town hall, a long, irregular structure somewhat in the Gothic style, uncouth in architecture, but picturesque from age. Its little steeple, tuneful with bells, seemed to have been borrowed from some other building and hastily clapped on as a finishing touch. Ascending the grand staircase, the boys soon found themselves in a rather gloomy apartment, containing the masterpiece of Lucas van Leyden, or Huygens, a Dutch artist born 370 years ago, who painted well when he was 10 years of age and became distinguished in art when only 15. This picture, called The Last Judgment, considering the remote age in which it was painted, is truly a remarkable production. The boys, however, were less interested in tracing out the merits of the work than they were in the fact of its being a triptych, that is, painted on 3 divisions, the 2 outer ones swung on hinges so as to close, when required, over the main portion. The historical pictures of Harold de Moor and other famous Dutch artists interested them for a while, and Ben had to be almost pulled away from the dingy old portrait of Van der Werf. The town hall, as well as the Egyptian museum, is on the Breedstraat, the longest and finest street in Leyden. It has no canal running through it, and the houses, painted in every variety of color, have a picturesque effect as they stand with their gable ends to the street. Some are very tall, with half their height in their step-like roofs. Others crouch before the public edifices and churches. Being clean, spacious, well shaded, and adorned with many elegant mansions, it compares favorably with the finest portions of Amsterdam. It is kept scrupulously neat. Many of the gutters are covered with boards that open like trapdoors, and it is supplied with pumps surmounted with shining brass ornaments, kept scoured and bright at the public cost. The city is intersected by numerous water roads formed by the river Rhine, there grown sluggish, fatigued by its long travel, but more than 150 stone bridges reunite the dissevered streets. The same world-renowned river, degraded from the beautiful, free-flowing Rhine, serves as a moat from the rampart that surrounds Leyden, and is crossed by drawbridges at the imposing gateways that give access to the city. Fine broad promenades, shaded by noble trees, border the canals and add to the retired appearance of the houses behind, heightening the effect of scholastic seclusion that seems to pervade the place. Ben, as he scanned the buildings on the Rappenburg Canal, was somewhat disappointed in the appearance of the great University of Leyden. But when he recalled its history, how, attended with all the pomp of a grand civic display, it had been founded by the Prince of Orange as a tribute to the citizens for the bravery displayed during the siege, when he remembered the great men in religion, learning, and science who had once studied there, and thought of the hundreds of students now sharing the benefits of its classes and its valuable scientific museums, he was quite willing to forgo architectural beauty, though he could not help feeling that no amount of it could have been misplaced on such an institution. Peter and Jacob regarded the building with an even deeper, more practical interest, for they were to enter it as students in the course of a few months. "Poor Don Quixote would have run a helpless tilt in this part of the world," said Ben, after Lambert had been pointing out some of the oddities and beauties of the suburbs. "It is all windmills. You remember his terrific contest with one, I suppose?" "No," said Lambert bluntly. "Well, I don't either, that is, not definitely, but there was something of that kind in his adventures, and if there wasn't, there should have been. Look at them, how frantically they whirl their great arms. Just the thing to excite the crazy knight to mortal combat. It bewilders one to look at them. Help me to count all those we can see, Van Monen. I want a big item for my notebook." And after a careful reckoning, superintended by all the party, Master Ben wrote in pencil, "Saw, December, 98 windmills within full view of Leyden." He would have been glad to visit the old brick mill in which the painter Rembrandt was born, but he abandoned the project upon learning that it would take them out of their way. Few boys as hungry as Ben was by this time would hesitate long between Rembrandt's home a mile off and Tiffin close by. Ben chose the latter. After Tiffin, they rested a while, and then took another, which for form's sake they called dinner. After dinner the boys sat warming themselves at the inn, all but Peter, who occupied the time in another fruitless search for Dr. Boekman. This over, the party once more prepared for skating. They were 13 miles from the Hague, and not as fresh as when they had left Brook early the previous day, but they were in good spirits, and the ice was excellent. End of chapter. Chapter 26 of Hans Brinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Hans Brinker, or The Silver Skates, by Mary Mapes Dodge. Chapter 26, The Palace in the Wood. As the boys skated onward, they saw a number of fine country seats, all decorated and surrounded according to the Dutchest of Dutch taste, but impressive to look upon, with their great formal houses, elaborate gardens, square hedges, and wide ditches, some crossed by a bridge, having a gate in the middle to be carefully locked at night. These ditches, everywhere traversing the landscape, had long ago lost their summer film and now shone under the sunlight like trailing ribbons of glass. The boys traveled bravely, all the while performing the surprising feat of producing gingerbread from their pockets and causing it to vanish instantly. 12 miles were passed. A few more long strokes would take them to the Hague, when Van Monen proposed that they should vary their course by walking into the city through the Bosch. "Agreed!" cried one and all, and their skates were off in a twinkling. The Bosch is a grand park or wood, nearly 2 miles long, containing the celebrated House in the Wood, Huis in Bosch, sometimes used as a royal residence. The building, though plain outside for a palace, is elegantly furnished within and finely frescoed. That is, the walls and ceiling are covered with groups and designs painted directly upon them while the plaster was fresh. Some of the rooms are tapestried with Chinese silks, beautifully embroidered. One contains a number of family portraits, among them a group of royal children who in time were orphaned by a certain axe, which figures very frequently in European history. These children were painted many times by the Dutch artist Van Dyck, who was court painter to their father, Charles I of England. Beautiful children they were. What a deal of trouble the English nation would have been spared had they been as perfect in heart and soul as they were in form. The park surrounding the palace is charming, especially in summer, for flowers and birds make it bright as fairyland. Long rows of magnificent oaks rear their proud heads, conscious that no profaning hand will ever bring them low. In fact, the wood has for ages been held as an almost sacred spot. Children are never allowed to meddle with its smallest twig. The axe of the woodman has never resounded there. Even war and riot have passed it reverently, pausing for a moment in their devastating way. Philip of Spain, while he ordered Dutchmen to be mowed down by hundreds, issued a mandate that not a bough of the beautiful wood should be touched. And once, when in a time of great necessity the state was about to sacrifice it to assist in filling a nearly exhausted treasury, the people rushed to the rescue, and nobly contributed the required amount, rather than that the Bosch should fall. What wonder, then, that the oaks have a grand, fearless air? Birds from all Holland have told them how, elsewhere, trees are cropped and bobbed into shape, but they are untouched. Year after year they expand in unclipped luxuriance and beauty. Their wide-spreading foliage, alive with song, casts a cool shade over lawn and pathway, or bows to its image in the sunny ponds. Meanwhile, as if to reward the citizens for allowing her to have her way for once, nature departs from the invariable level, wearing gracefully the ornaments that have been reverently bestowed upon her. So the lawn slopes in a velvety green, the paths wind in and out, flower beds glow and send forth perfume, and ponds and sky look at each other in mutual admiration. Even on that winter day the Bosch was beautiful. Its trees were bare, but beneath them still lay the ponds, every ripple smoothed into glass. The blue sky was bright overhead, and as it looked down through the thicket of boughs, it saw another blue sky, not nearly so bright, looking up from the dim thicket under the ice. Never had the sunset appeared more beautiful to Peter than when he saw it exchanging farewell glances with the windows and shining roofs of the city before him. Never had the Hague itself seemed more inviting. He was no longer Peter van Hope, going to visit a great city, nor a fine young gentleman bent on sightseeing. He was a knight, an adventurer, travel-soiled and weary, a hop of my thumb grown large, a Fortunatus approaching the enchanted castle where luxury and ease awaited him, for his own sister's house was not half a mile away. "At last, boys," he cried in high glee, "we may hope for a royal resting place, good beds, warm rooms, and something fit to eat. I never realized before what a luxury such things are. Our lodgings at the Red Lion have made us appreciate our own homes." End of chapter. Chapter 27 of Hans Brinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Hans Brinker, or The Silver Skates, by Mary Mapes Dodge. Chapter 27, The Merchant Prince and the Sister Princess. Well might Peter feel that his sister's house was like an enchanted castle. Large and elegant as it was, a spell of quiet hung over it. The very lion crouching at its gate seemed to have been turned into stone through magic. Within, it was guarded by genii, in the shape of red-faced servants, who sprang silently forth at the summons of bell or knocker. There was a cat also, who appeared as knowing as any Puss in Boots, and a brass gnome in the hall whose business it was to stand with outstretched arms ready to receive sticks and umbrellas. Safe within the walls bloomed a garden of delight, where the flowers firmly believed it was summer, and a sparkling fountain was laughing merrily to itself because Jack Frost could not find it. There was a sleeping beauty, too, just at the time of the boy's arrival, but when Peter, like a true prince, flew lightly up the stairs and kissed her eyelids, the enchantment was broken. The princess became his own good sister, and the fairy castle just one of the finest, most comfortable houses of the Hague. As may well be believed, the boys received the heartiest of welcomes. After they had conversed a while with their lively hostess, one of the genii summoned them to a grand repast in a red-curtained room, where floor and ceiling shone like polished ivory, and the mirrors suddenly blossomed into rosy-cheeked boys as far as the eye could reach. They had caviar now, and salmagundi, and sausage and cheese, besides salad and fruit and biscuit and cake. How the boys could partake of such a medley was a mystery to Ben, for the salad was sour, and the cake was sweet. The fruit was dainty, and the salmagundi heavy with onions and fish. But while he was wondering, he made a hearty meal, and was soon absorbed in deciding whether he really preferred the coffee or the anisette cordial. It was delightful, too, this taking one's food from dishes of frosted silver and liqueur glasses from which Titania herself might have sipped. The young gentleman afterward wrote to his mother that, pretty and choice as things were at home, he had never known what cut glass, china, and silver services were until he visited the Hague. Of course, Peter's sister soon heard all of the boys' adventures. How they had skated over 40 miles and seen rare sights on the way. How they had lost their purse and found it again. How one of the party had fallen and given them an excuse for a grand sail in an ice boat. How, above all, they had caught a robber, and so, for a second time, saved their slippery purse. "And now, Peter," said the lady when the story was finished, "you must write at once to tell the good people of Brook that your adventures have reached their height, that you and your fellow travelers have all been taken prisoners." The boys looked startled. "Indeed, I shall do no such thing," laughed Peter. "We must leave tomorrow at noon." But the sister had already decided differently, and a Holland lady is not to be easily turned from her purpose. In short, she held forth such strong temptations, and was so bright and cheerful, and said so many coaxing and unanswerable things, both in English and Dutch, that the boys were all delighted when it was settled that they should remain at the Hague for at least 2 days. Next, the grand skating race was talked over. Mevrouw van Ghent gladly promised to be present on the occasion. "I shall witness your triumph, Peter," she said, "for you are the fastest skater I ever knew." Peter blushed, and gave a slight cough as Carl answered for him. "Ah, mevrouw, he is swift, but all the Brook boys are fine skaters, even the rag pickers." And he thought bitterly of poor Hans. The lady laughed. "That will make the race all the more exciting," she said, "but I shall wish each of you to be the winner." At this moment her husband, Minear van Ghent, came in, and the enchantment falling upon the boys was complete. The invisible fairies of the household at once clustered about them, whispering that Jasper van Ghent had a heart as young and fresh as their own, and if he loved anything in this world more than industry, it was sunshine and frolic. They hinted also something about his having a heart full of love and a head full of wisdom, and finally gave the boys to understand that when Minear said a thing, he meant it. Therefore his frank, "Well now, this is pleasant," as he shook hands with them all, made the boys feel quite at home and as happy as squirrels. There were fine paintings in the drawing room, and exquisite statuary, and portfolios filled with rare Dutch engravings, besides many beautiful and curious things from China and Japan. The boys felt that it would require a month to examine all the treasures of the apartment. Ben noticed with pleasure English books lying upon the table. He saw also, over the carved upright piano, life-size portraits of William of Orange and his English queen, a sight that, for a time, brought England and Holland side by side in his heart. William and Mary have left a halo around the English throne to this day, he the truest patriot that ever served an adopted country, she the noblest wife that ever sat upon a British throne, up to the time of Victoria and Albert the Good. As Ben looked at the pictures, he remembered accounts he had read of King William's visit to the Hague in the winter of 1691. He who sang the Battle of Ivry had not yet told the glowing story of that day, but Ben knew enough of it to fancy that he could almost hear the shouts of the delighted populace as he looked from the portraits to the street, which at this moment was aglow with a bonfire kindled in a neighboring square. That royal visit was one never to be forgotten. For 2 years William of Orange had been monarch of a foreign land, his head working faithfully for England, but his whole heart yearning for Holland. Now, when he sought its shores once more, the entire nation bade him welcome. Multitudes flocked to The Hague to meet him. Many thousands came sliding or skating along the frozen canals from Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Laden, Haarlem, Delft, from Macaulay's History of England. All day long the festivities of the capital were kept up. The streets were gorgeous with banners, evergreen arches, trophies, and mottos of welcome and emblems of industry. William saw the deeds of his ancestors and scenes of his own past life depicted on banners and tapestries along the streets. At night superb fireworks were displayed upon the ice. Its glassy surface was like a mirror. Sparkling fountains of light sprang up from below to meet the glittering cascades leaping upon it. Then a feathery fire of crimson and green shook millions of rubies and emeralds into the ruddy depths of the ice. And all this time the people were shouting, "God bless William of Orange! Long live the King!" They were half mad with joy and enthusiasm. William, their own prince, their stadtholder, had become the ruler of 3 kingdoms. He had been victorious in council and in war, and now, in his hour of greatest triumph, had come as a simple guest to visit them. The king heard their shouts with a beating heart. It is a great thing to be beloved by one's country. His English courtiers complimented him upon his reception. "Yes," said he, "but the shouting is nothing to what it would have been if Mary had been with me." While Ben was looking at the portraits, Mynheer van Gent was giving the boys an account of a recent visit to Antwerp. As it was the birthplace of Quentin Matsis, the blacksmith who for love of an artist's daughter studied until he became a great painter, the boys asked their host if he had seen any of Matsis's works. "Yes, indeed," he replied, "and excellent they are. His famous triptych in a chapel of the Antwerp Cathedral, with the Descent from the Cross on the center panel, is especially fine, but I confess I was more interested in his well." "What well, mynheer?" asked Ludwig. "One in the heart of the city, near this same cathedral, whose lofty steeple is of such delicate workmanship that the French emperor said it reminded him of Mechlin lace. The well is covered with a Gothic canopy, surmounted by the figure of a knight in full armor. It is all of metal, and proves that Matsis was an artist at the forge as well as at the easel. Indeed, his great fame is mainly derived from his miraculous skill as an artificer in iron." Next, Mynheer showed the boys some exquisite Berlin castings, which he had purchased in Antwerp. They were iron jewelry, and very delicate. Beautiful medallions designed from rare paintings, bordered with fine tracery and openwork, worthy, he said, of being worn by the fairest lady of the land. Consequently, the necklace was handed with a bow and a smile to the blushing Mevrouw van Gent. Something in the lady's aspect, as she bent her bright young face over the gift, caused Mynheer to say earnestly, "I can read your thoughts, sweetheart." She looked up in playful defiance. "Ah, now I am sure of them. You were thinking of those noble-hearted women, but for whom Prussia might have fallen. I know it by that proud light in your eye." "The proud light in my eye placed me false, then," she answered. "I had no such grand matter in my mind. To confess the simple truth, I was only thinking how lovely this necklace would be with my blue brocade." So," exclaimed the rather crestfallen spouse. "But I can think of the other, Jasper, and it will add a deeper value to your gift. You remember the incident, do you not, Peter? How when the French were invading Prussia, and for lack of means the country was unable to defend itself against the enemy, the women turned the scale by pouring their plate and jewels into the public treasury." "Aha," thought Mynheer, as he met his vrouw's kindling glance. "The proud light is there now, in earnest." Peter remarked maliciously that the women had still proved true to their vanity on that occasion, for jewelry they would have. If gold or silver were wanted by the kingdom, they would relinquish it and use iron, but they could not do without their ornaments. "What of that?" said the vrouw, kindling again. "It is no sin to love beautiful things if you adapt your material to circumstances. All I have to say is, the women saved their country, and indirectly introduced a very important branch of manufacture. Is that not so, Jasper?" "Of course it is, sweetheart," said Mynheer. "But Peter needs no word of mine to convince him that all the world over women have never been found wanting in their country's hour of trial, though," bowing to Mevrouw, "his own countrywomen stand foremost in the records of female patriotism and devotion." Then, turning to Ben, the host talked with him in English of the fine old Belgian city. Among other things, he told the origin of its name. Ben had been taught that Antwerp was derived from Eindwerf, meaning on the wharf, but Mynheer van Gent gave him a far more interesting derivation. It appears that about 3,000 years ago, a great giant, named Antigonus, lived on the river Scheldt, on the site of the present city of Antwerp. This giant claimed half the merchandise of all navigators who passed his castle. Of course, some were inclined to oppose this simple regulation. In such cases, Antigonus, by way of teaching them to practice better manners next time, cut off and threw into the river the right hands of the merchants. Thus Handwerpen, or hand-throwing, changed to Antwerp, came to be the name of the place. The escutcheon, or arms of the city, has two hands upon it. What better proof than this could one have of the truth of the story, especially when one wishes to believe it? When Mynheer van Gent had related in 2 languages the story of Antwerp, He was tempted to tell other legends, some in English, some in Dutch, and so the moments, borne upon the swift shoulders of gnomes and giants, glided rapidly away toward bedtime. It was hard to break up so pleasant a party, but the Van Gent household moved with the regularity of clockwork. There was no lingering at the threshold when the cordial "Good night" was spoken. Even while our boys were mounting the stairs, the invisible household fairies again clustered around them, whispering that system and regularity had been chief builders of the master's prosperity. Beautiful chambers with 3 beds in them were not to be found in this mansion. Some of the rooms contained 2, but each visitor slept alone. Before morning, the motto of the party evidently was, "Every boy his own chrysalis," and Peter, at least, was not sorry to have it so. Tired as he was, Ben, after noting a curious bell rope in the corner, began to examine his bedclothes. Each article filled him with astonishment. The exquisitely fine pillow spread, trimmed with costly lace, and embroidered with a gorgeous crest and initial; the deck bed cover, a great silk bag large as the bed stuffed with swan's down; and the pink satin quilts, embroidered with garlands of flowers. He could scarcely sleep for thinking what a queer little bed it was. So comfortable and pretty, too, with all its queerness. In the morning he examined the top coverlet with care, for he wished to send home a description of it in his next letter. It was a beautiful Japanese spread, marvelous in texture, as well as in its variety of brilliant coloring, and worth, as Ben afterward learned, not less than $300. The floor was of polished wooden mosaic, nearly covered with a rich carpet bordered with thick black fringe. Another room displayed a margin of satinwood around the carpet. Hung with tapestry, its walls of crimson silk were topped with a gilded cornice which shot down gleams of light far into the polished floor. Over the doorway of the room in which Jacob and Ben slept was a bronze stork that, with outstretched neck, held a lamp to light the guests into the apartment. Between the 2 narrow beds of carved whitewood and ebony stood the household treasure of the Van Gents, a massive oaken chair upon which the Prince of Orange had once sat during a council meeting. Opposite stood a quaintly carved clothes-press, waxed and polished to the utmost, and filled with precious stores of linen. Beside it a table holding a large Bible, whose great golden clasps looked poor compared with its solid, ribbed binding made to outlast 6 generations. There was a ship model on the mantel-shelf, and over it hung an old portrait of Peter the Great, who, you know, once gave the dockyard cats of Holland a fine chance to look at a king, which is one of the special prerogatives of cats. Peter, though Tsar of Russia, was not too proud to work as a common shipwright in the dockyards of Saardam and Amsterdam, that he might be able to introduce among his countrymen Dutch improvements in shipbuilding. It was this willingness to be thorough even in the smallest beginnings that earned for him the title of Peter the Great. Peter the Little, comparatively speaking, was up first the next morning. Knowing the punctual habits of his brother-in-law, he took good care that none of the boys should oversleep themselves. A hard task he found it to wake Jacob Poot, but after pulling that young gentleman out of bed, and, with Ben's help, dragging him about the room for a while, he succeeded in arousing him. While Jacob was dressing, and moaning within him because the felt slippers provided him as a guest were too tight for his swollen feet, Peter wrote to inform their friends at Brook of the safe arrival of his party at the Hague. He also begged his mother to send word to Hans Brinker that Dr. Boekman had not yet reached Laden, but that a letter containing Hans's message had been left at the hotel where the doctor always lodged during his visits to the city. "Tell him also," wrote Peter, "that I shall call there again as I pass through Laden." The poor boy seemed to feel sure that the meester would hasten to save his father, but we, who know the gruff old gentleman better, may be confident he will do no such thing. It would be a kindness to send a visiting physician from Amsterdam to the cottage at once, if Juffrouw. In Holland, women of the lower grades of society do not take the title of Mrs. or Mevrouw when they marry, as with us. They assume their husbands' names but are still called Miss or Jufvrouw. If Jufvrouw Brinker will consent to receive any but the great king of the meesters, as Dr. Boekman certainly is. You know, Mother, added Peter, that I have always considered Sister Van Gent's house as rather quiet and lonely, but I assure you it is not so now. He says we make him wish that he had a houseful of boys of his own. He has promised to let us ride on his noble black horses. They are gentle as kittens, he says, if one have but a firm touch at the rein. Ben, according to Jacob's account, is a glorious rider, and your son Peter is not a very bad hand at the business. So we two are to go out together this morning, mounted like knights of old. After we return, Brother Van Gent says he will lend Jacob his English pony, and obtain 3 extra horses, and all of the party are to trot about the city in a grand cavalcade led on by him. He will ride the black horse which Father sent him from Friesland. My sister's pretty roan with a long white tail is lame, and she will ride none other, else she would accompany us. I could scarcely close my eyes last night after Sister told me of the plan. Only the thought of poor Hans Brinker and his sick father checked me. But for that I could have sung for joy. Ludwig has given us a name already, the Brook Cavalry. We flatter ourselves that we shall make an imposing appearance, especially in single file. The Brook Cavalry were not disappointed. Mynheer van Gent readily procured good horses, and all the boys could ride, though none was as perfect horsemen, or horseboys, as Peter and Ben. They saw the Hague to their heart's content, and the Hague saw them, expressing its approbation loudly, through the mouths of small boys and cart dogs, silently, through bright eyes that, not looking very deeply into things, shone as they looked at the handsome Carl, and twinkled with fun as a certainly portly youth with shaking cheeks rode past bumpity-bumpity-bump. On their return, the boys pronounced the great porcelain stove in the family sitting-room a decidedly useful piece of furniture, for they could gather around it and get warm without burning their noses or bringing on chilblains. It was so very large that, although hot elsewhere, it seemed to send out warmth by the houseful. Its pure white sides and polished brass rings made it a pretty object to look upon, notwithstanding the fact that our ungrateful Ben, while growing thoroughly warm and comfortable beside it, concocted a satirical sentence for his next letter, to the effect that a stove in Holland must, of course, resemble a great tower of snow, or it wouldn't be in keeping with the oddity of the country. To describe all the boys saw and did on that day and the next would render this little book a formidable volume indeed. They visited the brass cannon foundry, saw the liquid fire poured into molds, and watched the smiths who, half naked, stood in the shadow, like demons playing with flame. They admired the grand public buildings and massive private houses, the elegant streets and noble Bosch, pride of all beauty-loving Hollanders. The palace with its brilliant mosaic floors, its frescoed ceilings and gorgeous ornaments, filled Ben with delight. He was surprised that some of the churches were so very plain, elaborate sometimes in external architecture, but bare and bleak within with their blank, whitewashed walls. If there were no printed record, the churches of Holland would almost tell her story. I will not enter into the subject here, except to say that Ben, who had read of her struggles and wrongs and of the terrible retribution she had from time to time dealt forth, could scarcely tread a Holland town without mentally leaping horror-stricken over the bloody stepping-stones of its history. He could not forget Philip of Spain nor the Duke of Alva, even while rejoicing in the prosperity that followed the liberation. He looked into the meekest of Dutch eyes for something of the fire that once lit the haggard faces of those desperate, lawless men who, wearing with pride the title of beggars, which their oppressors had mockingly cast upon them, became the terror of land and sea. In Haarlem he had wondered that the air did not still resound with the cries of Alva's 3,000 victims. In Laden his heart had swelled in sympathy as he thought of the long procession of scarred and famished creatures who after the siege, with Adrian van der Werf at their head, tottered to the great church to sing a glorious anthem because Laden was free. He remembered that this was even before they had tasted the bread brought by the Dutch ships. They would praise God first, then eat. Thousands of trembling voices were raised in glad thanksgiving. For a moment it swelled higher and higher, then suddenly changed to sobbing. Not one of all the multitude could sing another note. But who shall say that anthem, even to its very end, was not heard in heaven? Here, in the Hague, other thoughts came to Ben, of how Holland in later years unwillingly put her head under the French yoke, and how, galled and lashed past endurance, she had resolutely jerked it out again. He liked her for that. What nation of any spirit, thought he, could be expected to stand such work, paying all her wealth into a foreign treasury and yielding up the flower of her youth under foreign conscription? It was not so very long ago, either, since English guns had been heard booming close by in the German Ocean. Well, all the fighting was over at last. Holland was a snug little monarchy now in her own right, and Ben, for one, was glad of it. Arrived at this charitable conclusion, he was prepared to enjoy to the utmost all the wonders of her capital. He quite delighted Mynheer van Gend with his hearty and intelligent interest. So, in fact, did all the boys, for a merrier, more observant party never went sightseeing. End of chapter. Chapter 28 of Hans Brinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Hans Brinker, or The Silver Skates, by Mary Mapes Dodge. Chapter 28, Through the Hague. The picture gallery in the Mauritshuis, a building erected by Prince Maurice of Nassau, one of the finest in the world, seemed to have only flashed by the boys during a 2-hour visit, so much was there to admire and examine. As for the royal cabinet of curiosities in the same building, they felt that they had but glanced at it, though they were there nearly half a day. It seemed to them that Japan had poured all her treasures within its walls. For a long period Holland, always foremost in commerce, was the only nation allowed to have any intercourse with Japan. One can well forego a journey to that country if he can but visit the museum at the Hague. Room after room is filled with collections from the Hermit Empire, costumes peculiar to various ranks and pursuits, articles of ornament, household utensils, weapons, armor, and surgical instruments. There is also an ingenious Japanese model of the island of Desina, the Dutch factory in Japan. It appears almost as the island itself would if seen through a reversed opera glass, and makes one feel like a Gulliver coming unexpectedly upon a Japanese Lilliput. There you see hundreds of people in native costumes, standing, kneeling, stooping, reaching, all at work, or pretending to be, and their dwellings, even their very furniture, spread out before you plain as day. In another room a huge tortoise-shell doll-house, fitted up in Dutch style and inhabited by dignified Dutch dolls, stands ready to tell you at a glance how people live in Holland. Gretel, Hilda, Katrinka, even the proud Richie Korbes would have been delighted with this, but Peter and his gallant band passed it by without a glance. The war implements had the honor of detaining them for an hour. Such clubs, such murderous krits, or daggers, such firearms, and above all, such wonderful Japanese swords, quite capable of performing the accredited Japanese feat of cutting a man in two at a single stroke. There were Chinese and other Oriental curiosities in the collection. Native historical relics, too, upon which our young Dutchmen gazed very soberly, though they were secretly proud to show them to Ben. There was a model of the cabin at Saardam in which Peter the Great lived during his short career as shipbuilder. Also, wallets and bowls, once carried by the beggar Confederates, who, uniting under the Prince of Orange, had freed Holland from the tyranny of Spain; the sword of Admiral von Speyk, who about 10 years before had perished in voluntarily blowing up his own ship; and Von Tromp's armor with the marks of bullets upon it. Jacob looked around, hoping to see the broom which the plucky admiral fastened to his masthead, but it was not there. The waistcoat which William III of England wore during the last days of his life possessed great interest for Ben, and one and all gazed with a mixture of reverence and horror worship at the identical clothing worn by William the Silent when he was murdered at Delft by Balthazar Queyratz. William, Prince of Orange, who became King of England, was a great-grandson of William the Silent, Prince of Orange, who was murdered by Queyratz, or Gerard, July 10, 1584. A tawny leather doublet and plain surcoat of grey cloth, a soft felt hat, and a high neck-ruff from which hung one of the beggar's medals, these were not in themselves very princely objects, though the doublet had a tragic interest from its dark stains and bullet holes. Ben could readily believe, as he looked upon the garments, that the silent prince, true to his greatness of character, had been exceedingly simple in his attire. His aristocratic prejudices were, however, decidedly shocked when Lambert told him of the way in which William's bride first entered the Hague. The beautiful Louise de Coligny, whose father and former husband both had fallen at the massacre of St. Bartholomew, was coming to be fourth wife to the prince, and of course, said Lambert, we Hollanders were too gallant to allow the lady to enter the town on foot. No, sir, we sent, or rather my ancestors did, a clean open post wagon to meet her, with a plank across it for her to sit upon. Very gallant indeed, exclaimed Ben with almost a sneer in his polite laugh. And she the daughter of an admiral of France. Was she? Upon my word, I had nearly forgotten that. But, you see, Holland had very plain ways in the good old time. In fact, we are a very simple, frugal people to this day. The Van Gent establishment is a decided exception, you know. A very agreeable exception, I think, said Ben. Certainly, certainly. But between you and me, Mynheer Van Gent, though he has wrought his own fortunes, can afford to be magnificent and yet be frugal. Exactly so, said Ben profoundly, at the same time stroking his upper lip and chin, which latterly he believed had been showing delightful and unmistakable signs of coming dignities. While tramping on foot through the city, Ben often longed for a good English sidewalk. Here, as in the other towns, there was no curb, no raised pavement for foot travelers, but the streets were clean and even, and all vehicles were kept scrupulously within a certain tract. Strange to say, there were nearly as many sleds as wagons to be seen, though there was not a particle of snow. The sleds went scraping over the bricks or cobblestones, some provided with an apparatus in front for sprinkling water to diminish the friction, and some rendered less musical by means of a dripping oil rag, which the driver occasionally applied to the runners. Ben was surprised at the noiseless way in which Dutch laborers do their work. Even around the warehouses and docks there was no bustle, no shouting from one to another. A certain twitch of the pipe, or turn of the head, or, at most, a raising of the hand, seemed to be all the signal necessary. Entire loads of cheeses or herrings are pitched from cart or canal boat into the warehouses without a word, but the passer-by must take his chance of being pelted, for a Dutchman seldom looks before or behind him while engaged at work. Poor Jacob Poot, who seemed destined to bear all the mishaps of the journey, was knocked nearly breathless by a great cheese, which a fat Dutchman was throwing to a fellow laborer, but he recovered himself, and passed on without evincing the least indignation. Ben professed great sympathy upon the occasion, but Jacob insisted that it was naughting. Then why did you screw your face so when it hit you? What for screw mine face? Repeated Jacob soberly. Why, it wash the... That what? insisted Ben maliciously. "Vy, de what you call dis, what you taste mit de nose?" Ben laughed. "Oh, you mean the smell." "Yesh, dat ish it," said Jacob eagerly. "It wash de smell. I draw mine face for dat." "Ha ha 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 ha!" roared Ben. "That's a good one. A Dutch boy smell a cheese. You can never make me believe that." "Vell, it ish no matter," replied Jacob, trudging on beside Ben in perfect good humor. "Wait till you hit mit cheese. Dat ish all." Soon he added pathetically, "Penchamin, I no likes to be called Dutch. Dat ish no goot. I bees a Hollander." Just as Ben was apologizing, Lambert hailed him. "Hold up! Ben, here is the fish market. There is not much to be seen at this season, but we can take a look at the storks, if you wish." Ben knew that storks were held in peculiar reverence in Holland, and that the bird figured upon the arms of the capital. He had noticed cartwheels placed upon the roofs of Dutch cottages to entice storks to settle upon them. He had seen their huge nests, too, on many a thatched gable roof from Brook to the Hague. But it was winter now. The nests were empty. No greedy birdlings opened their mouths, or rather their heads, at the approach of a great white-winged thing with outstretched neck and legs, bearing a dangling something for their breakfast. The longbills were far away, picking up food on African shores, and before they would return in the spring, Ben's visit to the land of dikes would be over. Therefore he pressed eagerly forward, as Van Mounen led the way through the fish market, anxious to see if storks in Holland were anything like the melancholy specimens he had seen in the zoological gardens of London. It was the same old story. A tamed bird is a sad bird, say what you will. These storks lived in a sort of kennel, chained by the feet like felons, though supposed to be honored by being kept at the public expense. In summer they were allowed to walk about the market, where the fish stalls were like so many free dining saloons to them. Untasted delicacies in the form of raw fish and butcher's offal lay about their kennels now, but the city guests preferred to stand upon one leg, curving back their long necks and leaning their heads sideways in a blinking reverie. How gladly they would have changed their petted state for the busy life of some hard-working stork mother or father, bringing up a troublesome family on the roof of a rickety old building, where flapping windmills frightened them half to death every time they ventured forth on a frolic. Ben soon made up his mind, and rightly too, that the Hague with its fine streets and public parks shaded with elms was a magnificent city. The prevailing costume was like that of London or Paris, and his British ears were many a time cheered by the music of British words. The shops were different in many respects from those on Oxford Street and the Strand, but they often were illumined by a printed announcement that English was spoken within. Others proclaimed themselves to have London stout for sale, and one actually promised to regale its customers with English roast beef. Over every possible shop door was the never-failing placard, "Tabac de coupe," tobacco to be sold. Instead of colored glass globes in the windows, or high jars of leeches, the drugstores held a gaping Turk's head at the entrance, or, if the establishment was particularly fine, a wooden mandarin entire, indulging in a full yawn. Some of these queer faces amused Ben exceedingly. They seemed to have just swallowed a dose of physic, but Van Mounen declared he could not see anything funny about them. A druggist showed his sense by putting a gaper before his door, so that his place would be known at once as an apotheek, and that was all there was to it. Another thing attracted Ben, the milkmen's carts. These were small affairs, filled with shiny brass kettles, or stone jars, and drawn by dogs. The milkman walked meekly beside his cart, keeping his dog in order, and delivering the milk to customers. Certain fish dealers had dog carts also, and when a herring dog chanced to meet a milk dog, he invariably put on airs and growled as he passed him. Sometimes a milk dog would recognize an acquaintance before another milk cart across the street, and then how the kettles would rattle, especially if they were empty. each dog would give a bound, and, never caring for his master's whistle, insist upon meeting the other halfway. Sometimes they contented themselves with an inquisitive sniff, but generally the smaller dog made an affectionate snap snap at the larger one's ear, or a friendly tussle was engaged in by way of exercise. Then woe to the milk kettles, and woe to the dogs. The whipping over, each dog, expressing his feelings as best as he could, would trot demurely back to his work. If some of these animals were eccentric in their ways, others were remarkably well behaved. In fact, there was a school for dogs in the city, established expressly for training them. Ben probably saw some of its graduates. Many a time he noticed a span of barkers trotting along the street with all the dignity of horses, obeying the slightest hint of the man walking briskly beside them. Sometimes, when their load was delivered, the dealer would jump in the cart and have a fine drive to his home beyond the gates of the city. And sometimes, I regret to say, a patient vrouw would trudge beside the cart with a fish basket upon her head and a child in her arms, while her lord enjoyed his drive, carrying no heavier burden than a stumpy clay pipe, the smoke of which mounted lovingly into her face. End of chapter. Chapter 29 of Hans Brinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Hans Brinker, or The Silver Skates, by Mary Mapes Dodge. Chapter 29. A Day of Rest. The sightseeing came to an end at last, and so did our boys' visit to the Hague. They had spent 3 happy days and nights with the Van Gens, and, strange to say, had not once, in all that time, put on skates. The 3rd day had indeed been one of rest. The noise and bustle of the city was hushed. Sweet Sunday bells sent blessed, tranquil thoughts into their hearts. Ben felt, as he listened to their familiar music, that the Christian world is one after all, however divided by sects and differences it may be. As the clock speaks everyone's native language in whatever land it may strike the hour, so church bells are never foreign if our hearts but listen. Led on by these clear voices, our party, with Mevrouw van Gent and her husband, trod the quiet but crowded streets until they came to a fine old church in the southern part of the city. The interior was large and, notwithstanding its great stained windows, seemed dimly lighted, though the walls were white and dashes of red and purple sunshine lay brightly upon pillar and pew. Ben saw a few old women moving softly through the aisles, each bearing a high pile of footstoves which she distributed among the congregation by skilfully slipping out the under one until none were left. It puzzled him that Minear should settle himself with the boys in a comfortable side pew after seating his vrouw in the body of the church, which was filled with chairs exclusively appropriated to the women. But Ben was learning only a common custom of the country. The pews of the nobility and the dignitaries of the city were circular in form, each surrounding a column. Elaborately carved, they formed a massive base to their great pillars, standing out in bold relief against the blank white walls beyond. These columns, lofty and well proportioned, were nicked and defaced from violence done to them long ago, yet it seemed quite fitting that, before they were lost in the deep arches overhead, their softened outlines should leaf out as they did into richness and beauty. Soon Ben lowered his gaze to the marble floor. It was a pavement of gravestones. Nearly all the large slabs, of which it was composed, marked the resting places of the dead. An armorial design engraved upon each stone, with inscription and date, told whose form was sleeping beneath, and sometimes 3 of a family were lying one above the other in the same sepulchre. He could not help but think of the solemn funeral procession winding by torchlight through those lofty aisles and bearing its silent burden toward a dark opening whence the slab had been lifted in readiness for its coming. It was something to think that his sister Mabel, who died in her flower, was lying in a sunny churchyard where a brook rippled and sparkled in the daylight and waving trees whispered together all night long, where flowers might nestle close to the headstone, and moon and stars shed their peace upon it, and morning birds sing sweetly overhead. Then he looked up from the pavement and rested his eyes upon the carved oaken pulpit, exquisitely beautiful in design and workmanship. He could not see the minister, though not long before he had watched him slowly ascending its winding stair, a mild-faced man wearing a ruff about his neck and a short cloak reaching nearly to the knee. Meantime the great church had been silently filling. Its pews were somber with men, and its center radiant with women in their fresh Sunday attire. Suddenly a soft rustling spread through the pulpit. All eyes were turned toward the minister, now appearing above the pulpit. Although the sermon was spoken slowly, Ben could understand little of what was said, but when the hymn came, he joined in it with all his heart. 1,000 voices lifted in love and praise offered a grander language than he could readily comprehend. Once he was startled, during a pause in the service, by seeing a little bag suddenly shaken before him. It had a tinkling bell at its side and was attached to a long stick carried by one of the deacons of the church. Not relying solely upon the mute appeal of the poor boxes fastened to the columns near the entrance, this more direct method was resorted to, of awakening the sympathies of the charitable. Fortunately Ben had provided himself with a few stivers, or the musical bag must have tinkled before him in vain. More than once a dark look rose on our English boy's face that morning. He longed to stand up and harangue the people concerning a peculiarity that filled him with pain. Some of the men wore their hats during the service, or took them off whenever the humor prompted, and many put theirs on in the church as soon as they arose to leave. No wonder Ben's sense of propriety was wounded, and yet a higher sense would have been exercised had he tried to feel willing that Hollanders should follow the customs of their country. But his English heart said over and over again, "It is outrageous, it is sinful." There is an angel called Charity, who would often save our hearts a great deal of trouble if we would but let her in. End of chapter. Chapter 30. Homeward Bound. On Monday morning, bright and early, our boys bade farewell to their kind entertainers and started on their homeward journey. Peter lingered a while at the lion-guarded door, for he and his sister had many parting words to say. As Ben saw them bidding each other good-bye, he could not but help feeling that kisses as well as clocks were wonderfully alike everywhere. The English kiss that his sister Jenny had given him when he left home had said the same thing to him that the Vrouw van Gen's Dutch kiss said to Peter. Ludwig had taken his share of the farewell in the most matter-of-fact manner possible, and though he loved his sister well, had winced a little at her making such a child of him as to put an extra kiss for mother upon his forehead. He was already upon the canal with Carl and Jacob. Were they thinking about sisters or kisses? Not a bit of it. They were so happy to be on skates once more, so impatient to dart at once into the very heart of Brook, that they spun and wheeled about like crazy fellows, relieving themselves meantime by muttering something about Peter and Dunder, not worth translating. Even Lambert and Ben, who had been waiting at the street corner, began to grow impatient. The captain joined them at last, and they were soon on the canal with the rest. "Hurry up, Peter," growled Ludwig. "We're freezing by inches. There, I knew you'd be the last after all to get on your skates." "Did you?" said his brother, looking up with an air of deep interest. "Clever boy." Ludwig laughed, but tried to look cross as he said, "I'm in earnest. We must get home sometime this year." "Now, boys," cried Peter, springing up as he fastened the last buckle, "there's a clear way before us. We will imagine it's the grand race. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Start!" I assure you that very little was said for the first half hour. There were 6 Mercuries skimming the ice. In plain English, they were lightning. No, that is imaginary too. The fact is, one cannot decide what to say when half a dozen boys are whizzing past at such a rate. I can only tell you that each did his best, flying, with bent body and eager eyes, in and out among the placid skates on the canal, until the very guard shouted to them to hold up. This only served to send them onward with a two-boy power that startled all beholders. But the laws of inertia are stronger even than canal guards. After a while Jacob slackened his speed, then Ludwig, then Lambert, then Carl. They soon halted to take a long breath and finally found themselves standing in a group gazing after Peter and Ben, who were still racing in the distance as if their lives were at stake. "It is very evident," said Lambert, as he and his 3 companions started up again, "that neither of them will give up until he can't help it." "What foolishness," growled Carl, "to tire themselves at the beginning of the journey. But they're racing in earnest, that's certain. Halloo! Peter's flagging." "Not so," cried Ludwig. "Catch him being beaten." "Ha ha!" sneered Carl. "I tell you, boy, Benjamin is ahead." Now, if Ludwig disliked anything in this world, it was to be called a boy. Probably because he was nothing else. He grew indignant at once. "Humph! What are you, I wonder? There, sir! Now look and see if Peter isn't ahead." "I think he is," interposed Lambert, "but I can't quite tell at this distance." "I think he isn't," retorted Carl. Jacob was growing anxious. He always abhorred an argument, so he said in a coaxing tone, "Don't quarrel! Don't quarrel!" "Don't quarrel!" mocked Carl, looking back at Jacob as he skated. "Who's quarreling? Poot, you're a goose." "I can't help that," was Jacob's meek reply. "See, they are nearing the turn of the canal." "Now we can see!" cried Ludwig in great excitement. "Peter will make it first, I know." "He can't, for Ben is ahead," insisted Carl. "Gunst, that iceboat will run over him. No, he is clear. They're a couple of geese, anyhow. Hurrah, they're at the turn. Who's ahead?" "Peter!" cried Ludwig joyfully. "Good for the captain!" shouted Lambert and Jacob. And Carl condescended to mutter, "It is Peter after all. I thought all the time that head fellow was Ben." This turn in the canal had evidently been their goal, for the 2 racers came to a sudden halt after passing it. Carl said something about being glad that they had sense enough to stop and rest, and the 4 boys skated on in silence to overtake their companions. All the while Carl was secretly wishing that he had kept on with Peter and Ben, as he felt sure he could easily have come out winner. He was a very rapid, though by no means a graceful skater. Ben was looking at Peter with mingled vexation, admiration, and surprise as the boys drew near. They heard him saying in English, "You're a perfect bird on the ice, Peter van Holp. The first fellow that ever beat me in a fair race, I can tell you." Peter, who understood the language better than he could speak it, returned a laughing bow at Ben's compliment but made no further reply. Possibly he was scant of breath at the time. "Now, Puncherman, what you do mit yourself? Get so hot as a fire brick, dat ish no goot," was Jacob's plaintive comment. "Nonsense," answered Ben. "This frosty air will cool me soon enough. I'm not tired." "You are beaten, though, my boy," said Lambert in English, "and fairly, too. How will it be, I wonder, on the day of the grand race?" Ben flushed and gave a proud, defiant laugh, as if to say, "This was mere pastime. I'm determined to beat then, come what will." End of chapter.